Good. Are we on air?
I believe so.
That's good, man. I'm doing pretty good. How are you doing?
I'm doing excellent. I'm doing excellent. And in fact, I'm doing so great. It's June.
It's true. It is.
June 2024. June 26th, 2024. It is Wednesday.
You're telling me. Yeah.
I am. My name is Kalden Dhatsenpa. I'm the host of Metropolis, a monthly news talk show where we cover events, affairs, the goings-ons of the city of Montreal. And there is quite a lot of stuff going on this month. There was F1. There was Saint Jean Baptiste. Happy belated Saint Jean Baptiste.
Thanks a lot. It means a lot.
What did you do for Saint Jean Baptiste?
What day was that? Monday?
That was Monday.
I don't. I think I went to Chalet Barbecue. I got a rotisserie chicken.
Fantastic.
And I went home and, probably watched TV or something.
Okay, well, you could have left that part out.
Yeah, I don't know that much. I don't have that interesting of a life, unfortunately.
No, that's not true. That's not true. In fact, our interesting guest, Gavin Armitage-Ackerman. Armitage? No, Armitage.
Armitage. Yeah.
Damn. I've known you how long now?
Like 7 years.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I've ever... How often are you saying your last name?
I mean, I don't just introduce myself like I'm Gavin Armitage-Ackerman when I meet people. Typically, I just say hi. I'm Gavin.
You should do that. Anyways, we have Gavin here, returning guest, to talk about housing.
Yeah.
People call you the housing guy.
People call me a housing guy for sure. I get a lot of DMs about housing. People say you're the housing guy. I go, if you're saying so.
Yeah. It
right.
comes with the territory, the property maybe.
Yeah. No.
What?
Are you calling me? I'm not a landlord. That's baseless. Baseless defamation.
So, Gavin, you're a urban planning researcher.
Yeah.
Housing rights activist.
Yeah.
You've written in the past for Canadian Dimension on housing policy in Quebec, as well as broadly in Canada as well.
Mm-hmm.
And this month, there is, as in the last few years, there's always sort of developments around housing.
Mm-hmm.
I say developments with a wink, obviously.
Okay, yeah. Okay, double entendre. It's good.
There you go.
It's good. Write that down.
This guy knows. The news coming out this month. Valérie Plante, the mayor of our beautiful city, her and her party, Projet Montreal, has sort of unveiled a new plan for the city. They call it Montreal 2050. A part of that plan is in the first slide here. We have the news that housing. And I guess to start it off, big news, I guess a first for North America here, Projet Montreal making some waves. I think it's sort of common knowledge that they're kind of anti-car, maybe not anti-car, but like they want to offer up more space for pedestrians, more street space for pedestrians, for active transportation, so rollerblading, biking, scootering, perhaps. And I guess, Gavin, did you hear about this news? Did you hear about this abolishing parking minimums? First off, what is a parking minimum? What is it exactly that they're abolishing?
Yeah, it's a good question. So parking minimums are basically a law that's tied to new developments of any kind, whether it's like commercial or residential. And it's basically just a rule that kind of just stipulates the proportion of parking stalls that you must have for how many residents are going to be living in that building. Or maybe for, if let's say it's a restaurant, it's going to be maybe the capacity of customers that are going to be in your restaurant or whatever. And obviously the point is pretty straightforward. It's just to make sure that historically, since we've been a very car-centric society and our cities have been really built for cars in North America, is to make sure that there's ample space for people to basically go to restaurants, participate in economic activity, that sort of stuff. In Montreal, though, it's a little bit antiquated. Not entirely. It's still really car-centric here. But in places like the Plateau and a lot of places on the island, it sort of doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right?
Why is that?
Well, so look at the Plateau. It's one of the densest neighborhoods in North America. and a ton of people are just using active transportation. They're either biking or they're using the metro or bus or something like that. And so it really just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to go to a developer, no matter what they're developing, and say, you must have 2 parking spaces for every single person that's moving in.
Right. So it's like here we have this neighborhood that's already sort of like using active transportation, that's using public transportation, and to ask developers to sort of have a minimum number of parking spots kind of goes against the character of the neighborhood, you're saying?
It goes against the character of the neighborhood, and it's also, in a lot of cases, might be redundant. Like, I mean, for sure, if you talk to a lot of people who drive in Montreal, they'll tell you that like the plateau is really difficult to drive in and find parking. And I totally get that. But the city is definitely, as we'll talk about a little bit later, they're looking to really increase transit ridership, increase the amount of people that are using active transportation. And so in that sense, it's like, why are you going to demand developers build 2 or 3 parking spaces? I mean, in certain suburban areas, especially in the U.S., but also in Canada, I mean, you might have a rule that says you need to have like 5, 6, 7 parking spaces.
My goodness.
Just really like, and so you end up having cities like, especially in the American Midwest, or in like states like Wyoming, for example, where literally there's like 200 parking spaces per person in the city, and it's just like it's really a huge waste of space, basically. Right.
That waste of space is actually a good segue into one of the articles that this article by Lorraine Carpenter kind of gets at. In the article in Cult Montreal, Montreal becomes largest North American city to eliminate mandatory minimum parking spots. Lorraine Carpenter says the Valerie Plante administration has been slowly abolishing has been the first to abolish parking minimums in Montreal. When urban planning experts and housing activists across North America began writing about the topic at length, the global climate and housing crisis has moved many municipal governments worldwide to do the same. And then this specific writer she mentions here wrote this in Strong Towns, this online publication in July 2018. 3 major problems with parking minimums, and I think this starts to get at I guess what you were talking about like how these parking spots use so much space, and how sometimes it's sort of having a mandatory, I guess, parking minimum kind of can be cumbersome, I guess, maybe for developers, and it's not always suited to the situation. But the 3 reasons in the Strong Towns article says, number 1, they rob us of financial productivity and prosperity. Number 2, they hinder small business owners, homeowners, developers, and renters. Number 3, they fill our cities with empty, useless space, which is, I think, what you're getting at, right? Like, I think sometimes you'll see those images sort of doing the rounds about like certain American towns before, when they had tramways, and then afterwards when they're kind of made more car centric, and you would see these huge parking lots, right? Like in the middle of downtown. It's like this is supposed to be a dense urban core, but you still have so much empty space, right? That has to be devoted to cars, and I guess the space that having this kind of private vehicle takes. Going back to this 3 major problems with parking minimums, I'm kind of curious what you make of these 3 reasons.
Okay, so the first one, so robbing us of financial productivity and prosperity. I mean, they're all sort of they're all pretty intuitive. Like the third one especially is they fill our cities with empty, useless space. Like, I mean, if you like, for example, go to a mall in the suburbs, or I mean, a mall even just on the island of Montreal, in a lot of cases, like, they'll basically build parking space to like build to the highest possible capacity for these places, for like businesses or for malls or for the movie theater or whatever, and pretty much it almost never reaches that capacity. And it's the same with parking minimums in general. Like in a lot of cases, you just are left with like gargantuan amounts of land that are never being used. I mean, they might be used by like some people parking their car at like 50% capacity, but so there's too much parking space. It's not being used for anything productive, and that's where I think the first point comes in, is they rob us of financial productivity. I mean, if you have a main street, for example, like especially in a small town like Montreal, this isn't as big of an issue. We're a really big city, but for other cities, this would be really, really beneficial to get rid of parking minimums and have less parking space, because you think about, you have like maybe one little commercial street. and it's mostly maybe a suburban kind of area or a small town, and so you really have like one main commercial place to go and do economic activity. And that's why, obviously you're going to have jobs, and also people like want things to do and want to have a nice place to be.
Restaurants,
Restaurants, exactly.
Yeah.
And if you dedicate like a third of all of that to, parking spaces, you're just basically robbing people of the opportunity to, I don't know. I mean, let's say like start a like a restaurant or maybe like a business that specifically meets the needs of local residents. It hinders like job growth. It stops you from concentrating useful things in an area in a way that people would like.
Sure.
And then the second one is really interesting though, because it hinders developers.
They hinder small business owners, homeowners, developers, and renters is what this article says. Yeah.
So that one's a really interesting one because it is true. I actually worked as a social housing developer, and it was really interesting because you get to really see sort of the inside scoop on a lot of the narratives that like private developers, who are the overwhelming amount of developers, like the arguments that they put forward and that the real estate industry puts forward, and they're not in that example. They're actually it is true. Like, they love to sort of cry wolf about like the government is like overly involved in real estate and all these things, and they're stifling our productivity. But in this case, it is actually true. Like parking minimums, depending on where you're building, can like really make or break a development project. Especially depending on like, if you're doing outdoor parking, for example, just like a parking lot. I mean, that's all land that you could have built units for people.
More housing, yeah.
You could have built more housing on the same amount of land and made the units cheaper, technically.
So for these people, it's like a restriction, right? On like they have this, because I think the way I understand it is like these kind of mandatory minimum parking kind of requirements have it. So you have this plot of land, whatever the square footage is. These parking requirements just kind of bind you to actually give up a space of that usable land, and instead of building like more restaurants, more kind of like, I guess, usable infrastructure, you actually have to use it specifically for parking.
Yeah, exactly. And, I mean, we talk a lot about private developers, but I think I worked obviously doing nonprofit development, and I can tell you that like, the city says that they want to, see more social housing development and nonprofit commercial development, like co-ops and these sorts of things. And that's great. And I'm obviously extremely supportive of that. I guess, it's important to acknowledge how like, private developers, they'll lose a bit of money on parking spaces for sure, and maybe they won't build the housing they want. But for a social housing developer, it's like, if you have a parking space ratio of like 3 to 1, like you have to have like 3 parking spaces or 2 parking spaces
per unit,
per person.
Per person.
It's usually per person. I mean, it's usually in Montreal per person.
Okay.
That's like extremely prohibitive. Prohibitive? Yeah, you know what I'm saying.
Restrictive.
Yeah, restrictive. It's really restrictive, and that could like, depending on where you're building those parking spaces, or it's like, it's just like you're going to be paying the same amount for that land no matter what. You pay $2 million for a plot of land as a developer. If you can only build on half of it, that doesn't. And the rest has to be parking space. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't change the fact that you had to pay $2 million for the plot of land. So it'd be
the cost of the land is the same, and I guess these mandatory parking requirements sort of like they just stifle what can be done with that land, right?
Yeah, I mean, you'd rather just use all the land that you can, especially if you're building affordable and social housing developments.
It's like if you're building social and affordable housing developments, I don't think each occupant is going to have 7 cars like in Wyoming, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm probably exaggerating. I'm sure there's probably not crazy minimums like that, but it does get really bad though. Specifically, like for housing developments, it is bad, but it also gets really bad for commercial stuff.
Right.
Like I said, that's a huge one. And so for Montreal, I think that will be really, really good. To get rid of that.
So you think this is kind of good news overall? I'm kind of curious what people in your sort of field are saying about this piece of news.
I would say that pretty much unanimously, this is something that's like pretty celebrated. like I said, parking minimums are sort of they're a little bit of a relic, right? They were put in place at a time where cars were becoming mainstream for the first time. Really, everybody in the middle class was aspiring to have a car, and cities were being designed to have these big beautiful boulevards, and like we want people to live in the suburbs and go drive into the city. And now
Let's
that's
go for a little Sunday drive.
yeah, I mean,
They made it into a hobby as well.
yeah, and now it's not really. I mean, it's still the case. Like we had tons of car infrastructure, but like clearly, I think people, for the reasons they say, like environmental reasons, we want people to drive less. It makes like bad downtowns.
Yeah.
Like who wants to go to downtown and it's just highways
Stuck in
and
traffic.
parking infrastructure?
Yeah.
Like it's just stupid.
Price of gas these days. I'm not going on a Sunday drive.
No.
I saw a funny joke that was like, I used to, when I used to be stressed, I would go for a drive to clear my mind. With the price of gas these days, I'm sitting with these thoughts.
That's pretty good.
You're wearing a car shirt. Is that on purpose?
Yeah, kind of like ironic, I guess. It's also one of my fave shirts.
It's good.
Kind of feeling swagged out a little bit.
Nice. Yeah. Thank you for swagging yourself out.
Yeah,
For this episode.
you told me to dress well. So
Yeah, you
I
wore
wanna
your
look
nicest
sharp.
T-shirt.
I shaved my bald head for you.
Incredible.
Looking good.
Can we get a look at that head?
Can we go zoom in? There we go.
Boom.
This is nice. This is good.
I think. I mean, I kind of, on a personal note, I do welcome this kind of development. In terms of like abolishing this kind of outdated parking system. I do sort of have reservations about it, and I kind of wonder if what you think about them, because it's like when I see that the people celebrating this are like small business owners and developers, I think there's something there that I'm like, I think that should be. It's not to say that this makes it not good news, I think it's much more that there's a function that this serves, which still helps places like social housing developers, right? Where it's like you're saying that their restrictions are now loosened and they can do with their properties and projects kind of what they want to build social and affordable housing. To me, it's still like it's something that's it still serves I guess private developers, and it's something that serves small business owners. I think a little, not I don't know about a little too much, but it's like I think I'm always worried when these are the people who are celebrating, right? Because it's like. I think ultimately, we were talking about this before, but like this is not quite a piece of news where something like power among renters is really being built. It's not something where like this is not. I hear this and I'm not thinking, oh, finally like the underserved are kind of taking back their city. I do think it's a thing where maybe the city will become a little more accessible. I think people will be able to breathe easier. It will make a place like nicer, but I do think it comes with its qualms, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I definitely get that, and I would agree. Like, there is always reason to be suspicious when you see, like, I think, private developers and their real estate lobby cheering something on, because those people typically are really, like, the enemies of renters and working class people, and so I get that. I think in this case, it just so happens that it is going to be. They're celebrating it because it's going to be like less restrictive, whereas we're celebrating it because it's like sure it's less restrictive on like private developers and stuff, but really that's not why we would be celebrating it. Like we're celebrating it because it's like, well, this is great. It's common sense. We can have better public spaces. I think it's just it is interesting though because the way that they have framed it is very much an issue of. We are independent developers, private actors, and now we have this is a win for small government is like how they're kind of pitching it. Sure. So it's less so like, oh, this is great to like create more like, inclusive, nice public spaces that provide economic opportunity. They don't care about any of that. They just go, we can make more profits now. And, in the case of certain like, small-time developers and social housing developers and co-ops, and it will be really great for them. So that's a win. But yeah, I mean, it means that like basically you could build a condo in downtown Montreal and you no longer have to build, a parking garage, for example. Sure. And, does it really matter if a private developer saves a whole bunch of money building their parking garage for their condo? I mean, I don't really care about that, Sure. But as we will see, I think later, they are going to argue that it's a really good thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. They being
The
private developers.
private developers and politicians as well. Right. It really plays into the supply side.
Something we didn't
economics.
really get into too much is, I guess, I always think it's kind of like impressive or interesting how much kind of car policy and transit policy exists at the municipal level, right? And you see that in the sense of like you have people like Valérie Plante and that kind of like political thought, which is kind of moving away from the old kind of car-centric sort of approaches to municipal politics. And I think I always try to like highlight that point where it's like in terms of like the actual moneyed interests in instituting things like mandatory parking minimums, in instituting things like wider roads and boulevards and these kinds of things, a lot of times the politicians that support that are backed by like car dealerships, right?
Yep.
And they're sort of backed by this lobby, this capital force that has the most to gain by ensuring that their products, their goods, cars in this case, have like a lot of like allotted infrastructure that comes, and specifically this infrastructure comes at a cost for things like other services, right? Like the city could be using that money that's using our car infrastructure instead for things like, I don't know, like better services, better public parks. Instead, it takes up a decent chunk of the money. And I always think it's important to remember that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think also on that point, it's on the flip side, you could also make sort of it's an analysis about the sort of the gentrification of the gentrifying effects of non-car infrastructure on the flip side, because I think it's important to realize that like while public transit and these sorts of things and bike lanes are really great and it in a lot of ways, politicians like Valérie Plante, maybe not her specifically, but I do think just in general, in a lot of those cases, those sorts of policies can act as a conduit for gentrification. And, you make a good point that it's like you could be widening these roads and you could be like building all this car infrastructure, and it's really just a waste of money. And I think that is how they see it, where they're thinking, I mean, this is basically land where we could raise land values and get more property taxes, right? Like that's what the city wants, is property taxes. That's how they fund everything.
It's their main kind of source of income.
Yeah, and like, basically like what's more valuable, a piece of land that's half buildings and half parking spaces, or a piece of land that is like a bunch of road infrastructure that's not worth anything, or, what's worth more, that or nice new boutique shops and new developments, like that's worth a lot more. And so I think from the city's perspective, it's maybe a bit of a cynical take, but I think the property tax incentive is a huge part of it from the city's perspective.
Yeah, I know. I mean, that kind of stuff binds so many municipal governments, not just in like Montreal, but like all across Canada, all across the U.S., where their main concern is like, how do we get money? I think it's something. There's a report by CUPE, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, that the CUPE put out about sort of how local governments make money, and it's something like out of one Canadian tax dollar, it's like 12 cents or even less goes to a municipal government, right?
Yeah.
So it's like that's incredibly restrictive of how they can make money, how they can fund their own projects of like whatever it might be, like for Valérie Plante, it might be like increasing public transportation, right? But you're just bound by the lack of money to do that, right?
Yeah.
And so what they have to rely on is these tools of like, all right, well, if we're relying on property taxes, we need to increase the values of these of property owners' properties, right? And so we do that by increase, like you go on like any kind of like Zillow or any kind of like property website, rentals, you'll see like walk score, like what's nearby, and you want to try and like maximize those numbers by making things much more walkable, by making things much more accessible, which of course are good things. They're nice things to have in life. It's really nice to be able to walk to like maybe like not like a few blocks away, and then you have your grocery store there. You have like a little flower shop, Then you have like a little cafe there. It's nice. It's just like life exists on a human scale where you don't need a car.
Yeah.
But I think it is at the point, like you're saying, where they're doing these things, and it sort of like amplifies pretty already existing gentrification, and it's sort of like people who are sort of like it not that it doesn't benefit people who aren't well off, but it absolutely benefits the property owners, right? That kind of class of people. When we look at like around Montreal, and like you have it, so it's like a lot of the actual poor neighborhoods, they're still relying on cars, right?
For sure.
They're still relying on cars. They're underserved by public transportation, so they have to be using their cars. You
Yeah.
see this in kind of like Park X. You see this in Saint
Yeah.
Michel, where we've had like protests about this kind of car stuff.
Yeah.
And I think the cynical approach by some of these urban planners or these kinds of people who laud these kinds of gains might be that like, oh, look at these kinds of car-pilled people. Look at these people who are like
Yeah.
so backwards, still relying
Yes,
on their
man.
cars.
I'm
Yeah,
car-pilled. Yeah, let's
I mean,
go.
I love driving. I love driving's fun, but I do understand that there's I guess a toll it takes on infrastructure and government.
Yeah.
But I think So anyways, I think I'm always kind of wary of like stuff where people will get snooty about cars being so
Yeah.
anti-car that they forget that like some people are bound by their cars, not by any kind of political choice or ideological thing, not even cultural reason, but it's just purely because
Yeah.
they are underserved by public transportation and that they are not in accessible areas because of that poverty.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's like, I think you hear a lot of talk about like the 15-minute city. I mean, there's all sorts of like weird shit now where it's just like, it's become this like right-wing conspiracy or something.
The
you know.
15-minute city?
Yeah, I don't know if you've heard about this, but there's like a bunch of like, the 15-minute city is just what you've described, is that you could get to anything you need in 15 minutes, but it's now been picked up by like right-wing politicians and stuff like that, where like liberals don't want you to leave a 15-minute like
They want you in a
circle, yeah, like whatever. And so now it's kind of, I feel like for that reason it's kind of becoming like a little bit like less popular, but really the reason it should be not popular is it's not actually because of that, but it's for all the reasons you've mentioned. The 15-minute city, and they do studies on this, I mean, it's because it's such a popular concept, overwhelmingly benefits wealthier, whiter populations,
There it is.
basically.
And
And
the Republicans are against that.
well, yeah, I guess in a weird twist of fate, yeah.
Well,
Because again, it's big government,
right,
you know?
right, of course. Yeah. They're trying to mandate how you
But
should live.
but it's funny because it's really not. It's the opposite of big government. I mean, a lot of the 15-minute city stuff is all about basically getting rid of as many government restrictions as possible and letting people build as much as they can and whatever.
People are going
And
to build
so
nearby. Like in your community, you're going to be like, oh, like I have to walk a little too far for this kind of thing. Maybe
Yeah.
I would consider opening up one up closer.
yeah. I mean, so a case in point, I guess, to just really wrap that thought up is, you mentioned Park X, and that's a great example of they've been having some problems because obviously Park X is gentrifying. There's like students moving there. They opened up the new campus, university campus, right at the edge of Park Extension. So a lot of young students moving in there, and it's a majority, visible minority neighborhood.
A lot of South Asians there.
A lot of South Asians. It's a huge landing point for immigrants. It's like one of the main landing points for immigrants in the Montreal metro area. But now you got all these, wealthier, well-off students that are coming in and taking places, and now there's kind of this focus to beautify the area and to like add bike lanes and make it, like fit that 15-minute city kind of vibe. Like you could just get on a bike and get anywhere, and you could just walk anywhere. But the local residents, that actually doesn't speak to the needs of the local residents because, as you say, a lot of lower income populations do rely on car use. Like oftentimes they're not lucky enough to live really close to their workplace. In fact, I think they did a study in Montreal specifically on the 15-minute city and found like 1.2% of people or something live within a 15-minute city kind of bubble where they could actually access everything.
Tiny percentage.
It's a tiny percentage. It's basically just like an urban myth. Like it just doesn't, it's like a fake concept. And especially for these poorer people, they don't live anywhere near where they work. Like, oftentimes they're having to drive or get bussed out to maybe go work on a farm or do manual labor, these sorts of things. So obviously they don't want a bike lane that's going to get rid of all the parking. Yeah. So it goes both ways. I mean, it's like mandatory parking minimums, get rid of them, but also, speak to the context of the neighborhood and their needs, right?
I feel like Projet Montreal is like, here you go, bike lanes, so now you can bike 2 hours to your Amazon job.
Yeah, literally, right? So typically the people that are really advancing these causes, like bike lane, not that I have anything against like the concept of a bike lane and transit, right? Like it's fine. I mean, I don't.
Bike lane, you get mad.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't ride a bike, so I'm like might be the only urban planner that doesn't care about bikes, but it's great. I mean, if people can get around easier, that's fantastic. But don't be using it just to basically please like wealthy, upwardly mobile populations that want to come work at Ubisoft,
Sure.
or whatever. Like, it basically just serves them really in a lot of cases.
Sure. that kind of class of people.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's why it's always good to have a class analysis of these kinds of things.
Exactly. Yeah.
We're gonna go on to our second topic here. We're staying in the world of housing because Gavin's our housing guy. You're the housing guy, so people send you housing stuff, right?
Yeah.
I am among that crowd where anytime I see a little piece of housing news, housing policy, I always send it to you to be like, yo, what do you think? This article is one of those things I sent you. So
Yeah,
this
it
is
was good.
an
Good
article
article.
by Erica Morris in CBC. It's titled "Quebec's Housing Crisis Goes Beyond Supply and Demand," says new report. The subtitle says, "Investing in social housing, the true solution, advocates insist." This is by Erica Morris in CBC News, published this month, June 2024. I guess before we go into it, this is something you've been saying.
Yeah, I mean, as we'll see when we go through the article a little bit, there's a really, I mean, I would say there's an exclusive focus in Canada, especially in Canada, most countries right now, I think, but especially like in Canada where the housing crisis is so bad, there's this exclusive focus on the idea of building more supply. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. It's politically convenient for politicians to just come out and say, hey, they can throw a number out. We're going to build 1 million new homes or whatever. I mean,
They're just going through their calculator and trying to think of the biggest number.
pretty
They're
much.
like,
And they're all
this
just
is how many
competing,
houses we'll build.
Yeah, and I mean, right now you got like Trudeau going, I'm going to build this many houses. You got Polyev going, oh, we're actually going to get rid of the big government. We're going to build more houses. And all among that is just like amidst that whole debate is just really this one crucial question that just nobody will ask, which is that, well, does building more supply necessarily mean lowering home prices? And there's an overwhelming amount of new research coming out on this phenomenon over the last like 10 to 20 years. People are looking at it, and it's basically the research just says it's a lot more complicated.
Right.
It's not just line go up, other line go down. Like build more supply, price goes. It's like that's not how economics works.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they would try to have you believe that a lot of the time, right?
Yeah. Let's get into this.
Yeah, for sure.
I have some quotes I pulled out of this. So, the housing crisis is not rooted in a supply and demand issue as commonly framed by government officials, according to a new report by housing groups. This report by RECLAC, or the Regroupement des Comités de Logement et Associations Locataires du Québec, essentially just like multiple housing committees and tenants kind of groups together. Cedric Dussault, from a spokesperson for RECLAC, who I've interviewed before, he says the solution is more social housing, more restrictions on unit repossessions, more rent control measures, and a province-wide rental registry to boost the supply of truly affordable housing. In the report, they highlight things like the rent in Montreal going up by an average of 27% between 2020 and 2024, which is
It's pretty
it's quite a
it's
lot.
pretty egregious, honestly.
And then Cedric Dussault continues. It's not a question of building more. We've built a lot of housing in the last 20 years in this province. The problem is what is built does not necessarily answer the needs we see. He continues to say, it is completely utopic to think that the rental market will simply balance itself out as if we build more. So I guess here we have Cedric Dussault from RECLAC kind of going into these points about like the assumption that building more is sort of the solution, or that simply more units means housing crisis go down. It's like, imagine there's like just a single knob that politicians can like control.
Yeah.
And a lot of politicians see it as like number of housing up, and they hope to God that the housing crisis goes down.
Yeah, and they're just turning the knob and they're looking back. They're like, huh? And they're like turning the knob. Yeah, just seeing if people like it, right? And nothing happens, basically.
So I know there's like there's a lot of things where like that people talk about. I mean, I feel like the housing crisis is sort of the I've always thought of the housing crisis as sort of the kind of defining material class issue of I guess like our kind of current epoch.
Yeah.
Because you have stuff about like, let's say like wage, like the people's wages and sort of workers' rights. That has been this classic issue of material life.
Yeah.
But to me, I feel like the housing one is becoming more and more, I guess, unique to this era, considering stuff about how housing and property has sort of become this financial tool, a financial asset, right?
Yeah.
You've written about this, and also how like even beyond that, it's like because it's this financial asset, it has sort of become net worth for so many kind of like working class families, right? Where it's like you have a lot of people who like the most valuable thing they own that's to their name is going to be their property. You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
And because of that kind of foundational thing, it's like spun off into like I guess just a complete monstrosity of a market, let's say, right?
Totally. I mean, the idea of, homes and housing being used as a financial asset, it's obviously not new, and it's come in sort of a couple different forms. And like you say, the first one was really sort of you could say almost the privatizing of retirement and pensions and that type of stuff. I mean, really encouraging people to invest in their homes as their main asset so that when they retire, they can sell it, and promising them, a permanent amelioration in the price of their home and the value of their home, and
it can only go up.
Yeah, and so that's the one thing is sort of really tying up people with in their mortgage and their home value. And on the flip side, that would have been kind of post-war, very much like building a lot of homes, putting people out in the suburbs, American dream, Canadian dream, whatever. You're a homeowner now. Everybody gets to be their own little capitalist, And I mean, this would be a whole other conversation, but very much designed to basically, it was specifically designed that way to sort of like atomize people.
Sure. Everyone gets their own little kingdom.
Every man his castle. It's like sort of like the classic thing, and like let's separate people and sort of disintegrate, communities and like public life in a way, like, so that's the one part of it. But now it's sort of taken on a whole new form, which is that since the 80s and 90s, there's been such dramatic financialization of housing, which is, as you say, it's just basically, it's gone from financializing housing for regular people, which is that you're going to buy a house and now you're going to have that as your asset, to now it's being turned into like a massive, like multinational corporations are basically just gaming housing and the housing market to like suck money out of the market.
Yeah. If anything, I feel like for these giant like holding companies that own all these investments in housing, we use the term investment, but they see it as that, right?
Yep.
Where it's like having this huge amount of housing, having ownership of almost like 40-50% of cities, some Canadian cities, is much more financially stable than having stocks or owning just like regular kind of like shares.
Yeah, 100%. Maybe especially because the government would refuse to allow housing to crash. I mean, could you imagine how catastrophic it would be, not only just for the economy in general, if if property values all collapse and now that you don't get property taxes and this and that, and that's what happens to like a city like Detroit, right?
Right.
Where a great point. It's a downward kind of spiral, but not only would they not allow homes to go down in price because of that, but also like who is going to, and this is maybe gets to some of the hypocrisy that they're kind of pointing out in this article, is like who is going to vote for somebody that comes out and says we're going to decrease the value of your home after they've basically just been told their whole lives you need to own a home and you need to have that asset in order to retire and live a happy life.
You're going to own a home. That's going to be your main like asset. And as different levels of government, we will do our part to make sure that number goes up. Yeah, no, exactly. And that's sort of like the deal.
Yeah, there's kind of like there's a funny disconnect that I think is worth mentioning, is that when you look at discussions with, I think even it was like Justin Trudeau recently, who's obviously not doing so hot right now, But to be honest, like in this case, it's hypocritical, but I also understand why he would say this. Like he comes out and says, we're going to build all these new homes and it's going to make housing more affordable. And then an interviewer asks him, oh, so you're saying that if we build more housing, it's going to decrease the value of real estate and make homes more affordable? And he goes, well, no. Like that's not what's going to happen. Yeah. So then it just begs the question, is like, okay, well, you're saying, so the developers and, private sector advocates say we need to build more supply in order to lower the cost of housing, but then you have the government coming out and saying it's not going to lower the price of housing, and even if it did, we wouldn't allow it. So it's like, so what's going on? Like, what's the point of building the housing? And then I think it just basically immediately sort of makes you think like, okay, well, like, if developers are profit driven and that's the whole point, like, why would they be building all of this housing in order to lower the value of property in the first place? Anyways,
selling,
right? Like, not only is the government saying we're not going to let prices go down, but like, why would the development industry all come together and go, let's lower the value of the thing that we all make money off of, and like, let's make less money, let's make housing less valuable and less profitable. Obviously, that just does not make any sense, right? It's just. So yeah. Anyways, there's some internal contradictions in a lot of the stuff that these lobbyists and the government say.
Do you think these lobbyists are the kind of I guess what I'm wondering is, like, when we look at this kind of article about supply and demand and this argument for increased supply and how there's holes in it, I'm trying to wonder, who are the people who are trying to say there should be more supply? Who are the people who benefit from that kind of idea?
Well, that's a really interesting question because, on the one hand, it is lobby groups, like, for example, like landlord associations, the real estate lobby, and government officials who obviously, like I've said, have this sort of political investment in keeping home values high, but also, they want to tell people, hey, vote for me, I'll make housing affordable, we'll build more supply. So there's that. But on the other hand, there's also a lot of these people you call like market urbanists who are, I think in some cases may have their heart in the right place. But I would say that this is the mainstream position. Not that I would say that my take is necessarily a marginal one. Like, there's a lot of skepticism. People call it supply skepticism. I think that's like a pretty vocal debate that's going on. But the majority of urban planners, or at least the majority of planning policy, is very supply side oriented. Unfortunately, it's a inherently neoliberal political movement for sure. Yeah.
So it's maybe against. So Cedric Dussault here from Hook is kind of going against that kind of neoliberalism. He's kind of going against the idea that it's just a supply side issue. Because I mean, he talks about it's not a question of building more, because he says they've built a lot. Quebec has built a lot in the last 20 years, but it's the type of property that's being built. It's the type of residence, I guess, that's being built. Later on in the article, we have Guillaume Houle, a spokesperson for Quebec's Construction Association. So here we have, I guess, someone from an alternative viewpoint that's not necessarily someone from the social housing advocacy kind of world. Instead, he's from the construction kind of world, representing development and construction. What we have built over the last months, is mainly luxury condos or apartments, because it's what we can afford to build right now, he says. Later on in the article, he goes talking about how they want to build more social housing, but there's just not much money in it. I'm kind of wondering what you think about his view of it, because it's something you talked about before, right? About the construction that's happening. A lot of it is at the top level of kind of like value, right? So it's like, if someone wants to make something and turn the most profit off of it, they're gonna make a luxury condo versus an affordable condo.
For sure. And also, to that point, like, not only are they going to build towards the high end of the market, because we should keep in mind when they talk about the housing market, they talk about it as the housing market, as if the housing market is one uniform thing.
Right.
But there's actually many sub-markets. Like, you have, and the majority of that's going into the high market, because that's where the most profit is. But there's also mid and lower market stuff that, they're not going to build because it doesn't profit as much. And then similarly, when they're talking about saying, most of the stuff being built is condos and whatever, another thing that's important to keep in mind during all these discussions of supply is that in a lot of cases, when we talk about upzoning, kind of like how getting rid of parking minimums often affects poorer neighborhoods and negatively affects poorer populations, the same goes with new supply. And I think, if you look at a lot of the places where new supply is typically being focused and built, I mean, a good example would be a place like, Griffintown, right, in Montreal. Or maybe Verdun is kind of a good example, sort of a traditionally working class area where there's not as much new development in Montreal because it's so old, but you get what I mean. Like,
Griffintown, there's so much new development, right?
I mean,
Griffintown has been like hollowed out and then completely replaced.
Yeah, and that was a historically working class neighborhood, poorer neighborhood.
Irish.
And that's how it's happened with a lot of downtowns in North America, is that they've become disinvested, and then developers come in and go, we need to build more supply. We got to build more supply. Where do they build it? They build it in, like disadvantaged, disinvested neighborhoods.
Sure. This is where property's cheap.
Yeah, exactly, because they want to profit. They're going to build a condo, and they're going to build a condo where it's cheap, and that's where it's cheap, right?
Yeah,
so I think it's good that you mentioned that quote, because he's right. On the one hand, you have a guy saying, well, it's not just supply that we need; it depends what's being built, and that's completely true, right? Like, it's not just you can build anything. And then on the flip side, you got this other guy who's saying, well, we'd love to build social housing. It's like, well, no, you wouldn't, because you could be a social housing developer.
Yeah.
You're just not a social housing developer because you want to make more money.
Yeah.
So there's
nothing really stopping him from building social housing.
Nothing stopping you from building social housing. It's tough, and development's tough, but you could go do that if you wanted to. There's lots of small, independent social housing developers. I worked for one, so he's just a scammer, He's scamming. I don't like that guy.
I don't know about that part.
He bugs me. Yeah, don't like that guy.
Let's go on to I guess the last topic, and I guess the sort of one that undergirds this discussion was we're going back to now the plan 2050 Montreal. Imagine Montreal in 2050.
Yeah,
that's what Valérie Plante and the administration is doing, and they put forward a pretty lengthy PDF. Kind of detailing what the city of Montreal could look like in 2050.
Yeah.
Part of this is like a bunch of tramways, an accessible city. They're imagining 20%, I believe, of the market of actual housing in Montreal to be social and affordable.
Yeah.
Which is, I guess, very ambitious. Let me actually read a little bit from it. So, the introduction to Montreal 2050. The 2050 Draft Land Use and Mobility Plan invites you to reflect on the island, on the Montreal of tomorrow. The aim is to revisit our urban development model so we can improve quality of life for the next 25 years.
Yeah.
And I guess in this we have some of the arguments we've been talking about, right? Where, like, if we were talking about increasing supply, this draft plan absolutely has kind of provisions where it's imagining this incredible increase in numbers. The number they say is more than 200,000. Specifically, the plan states they're gonna be building more. No, they're gonna be building 207,000 housing units between now and 2050.
Yeah.
Guaranteeing an abundant, diversified, high quality, and affordable residential supply. Although Montreal is facing a shortage of affordable housing, the Land Use and Mobility Plan aims to introduce mechanisms to accelerate the pace of housing starts. And yet again, I'm on my Gavin the Housing Guy. What do you think of this? But Gavin the Housing Guy, what do you think of this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first thing that's really quite obvious is that this is pretty. I mean, it's pretty bold, and it's. I can say that just from reading the plan myself that it I know that it's sort of a draft plan, and it's supposed to be more of a high-level thing to sort of guide, the development of the city over the next 25 years. But, it wasn't really clear how they're actually going to achieve this. And a professor from actually McGill, who I've had, I studied with him, he made a pretty good point of being like, well, how is the city even going to pay for any of this? Not in a sort of like the classic kind of conservative sense of like, where's the money going to come from? But like literally like the city specifically only obviously gets their money from property taxes. So, good luck building that many homes and building all the tramways and all the things that they've put in there if the provincial government won't fund it. That'd be my initial thought. I'd also say that just for context, Montreal, we're pretty far behind in housing starts, but as they've pointed out in the previous article, we're still sort of outpacing, even though we have such low housing starts, so like new homes being built, we're still outpacing population growth well enough, which is good. But we're only building about 2,000 new units a year.
Right.
Yeah, in the city of Montreal currently, which, is seemingly fine. Like they've done research showing, well, we're building enough.
Looking at like in terms of like, I guess, the new number of units being built a year compared to the number of population increase, as far as those are concerned, we're kind of safe.
That's what they say. Yeah.
Sure.
Now, it seems like that's true according to their research. We're also only building, from what I understand, about 2,000 units a year. This plan, if you broke it down, would actually increase that up to about 8,000 a year. So, that raises a whole lot of questions. First off, like, how are you going to do that?
Are you going to quadruple the number of housing starts a year?
Yeah, how are you going to do that? Where are you going to be putting them? And then it also it is kind of worrying because to me it's like if you build 8,000 units a year, sure that's new supply, but you're adding like expensive supply all at once. Market urbanists, neoliberal people would tell you, well, that's fine because in 25 years, all of those buildings will be really old and they'll become affordable. But right now, like, as somebody I'm like stuck in like a rent controlled apartment that I'd like to leave, but I can't find anything else because the price of rent is going up so much. What's going to happen when they suddenly drop 8,000 and then 16,000 and then I don't know what number comes after that, but that's a lot of housing, right? Big number, not good.
Yeah. Scary.
Yeah, but all of that at once, really concentrated, could be problematic depending on how it happens, right?
Yeah.
So.
But and there's no real plan for how it's going to happen, it seems.
No, I mean, I went through it, and it seems, they say that they want to use certain mechanisms to encourage more housing, and from my understanding, from looking through it, it seems that they've basically just changed land uses, because the whole the whole plan is just, it's just land use maps, which obviously I'm not going to look at because it's incredibly boring, but I flipped through it and was like, oh, okay, I see.
What is a land use map?
It literally just like, zoning pretty much. Like, okay, like what are you allowed to build here at what density and what use? Like commercial, residential, mixed use, industrial. They basically have just gone through and changed zoning a lot. And I mean, we'll see how successful even that is because they have to go through community consultations. And I wouldn't be surprised if like a lot of places that they've upzoned on the island, residents come out. If it's like single family neighborhoods, they come out and go, we don't want this plan. We don't want you to build a condo in our suburban neighborhood. Wouldn't really blame them, So I don't know. That's my take. It's just improbable. A lot of questions.
I guess. I mean, just to go back to like the previous discussion, I guess. What do you think is going on through the minds of Projet Montreal, Valérie Plante, and the administration when they present a plan like this? Like, why present a plan like this at this stage? What do you think is like the kind of backing idea behind this kind of plan?
Yeah, well, I think it's they're proposing it because it's very aspirational and it's very flashy, and I think that's a lot of. I'm really critical of. I've mentioned it, market urbanists, not just because of supply side like Reaganomics being applied to the city. It's not just that. Obviously, I hate that. It's not good. But also, I think that there's a huge problem in urban planning that we have to acknowledge, which is that there is an aestheticization of urban problems in the city. So, which is to say that like a lot of what's in this plan, it's like they're proposing it because it's really flashy, and who's going to say I don't want to have a nice tram in my neighborhood? Like they want to build all these tramways. Like no one's going to say we don't want nice public transit unless it's maybe like some sort of NIMBY like high income like white homeowner community that's like we don't want riffraff coming in. But other than that, any normal person wants this stuff. People love green space.
We want riffraff.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I don't know. What I'm saying is people like green space. They love transportation.
Of course.
They love more housing. Oh, it's going to make housing affordable. Like, who's going to say no to any of those things? But then there's not really sort of a critical analysis underpinning that of going, like, for example, if you just like build a bunch of beautiful green space, which is great, but like, I mean, what's the plan for like increasing all the land values?
Sure. And
like people that might get displaced from that. How are we making sure that when transit's built, it's not just like the REM, which has been widely condemned as like a very, I think unanimously among urban planners as just like a stupid project. You will still have like market urbanist, pop urbanist people who watch like YouTube videos on like cycling planning and whatever. Like they're like, I love the REM, I love public transit, I love trains, and it's like the whole thing is just
one-dimensional.
It's one-dimensional. That's it. It's like maybe think about like where it's being built, how it's being used to raise land values, to encourage private profits from development. Like there's just a lot going on, and I think that it's very reductionist. It can be very reductionist to just present these things as just unanimously good.
Right. It's like the issue with the housing crisis is the city's not beautiful enough. Yeah,
and it's I mean, I love going to the park. right? Like I love going to the park. I'm not going to pretend I
That's
don't
gonna
like
be my
going.
next question. Do you like?
I'm going to the park right after this.
Nice.
Yeah, we're digging into my park time right now. I'd love to get the hell out of here.
Well, I mean, listen. No, that sort of wraps it up. I don't
I
want
guess
to
so,
get
yeah.
in the way of your park time.
Yeah.
No, I think this was a good conversation on sort of the. I think what you highlighted is the market urbanism of these kinds of approaches, the way that the city is sort of limited by the property taxes, and how that kind of has so much to do with how they think about these problems.
Yeah, I guess I would also want to just add on and conclude that it's also important to acknowledge that being critical of this stuff does not mean that you're just openly against it and condemning it. Like, I'm not against like new homes being built when we need, like, because people need to have a place to live.
Course,
I'm not
right.
against. I love green space. I love taking
You love
the
parks.
bus. I fucking love parks, dude. Am I allowed to say that?
allowed to say
Is he allowed to say that? But it's not about saying those things are bad. And I think when you criticize those things, people will be very quick to tell you, oh, you're against like the supply side arguments. You must just be, you're a NIMBY, you know, you hate new housing being built, whatever. You're hurting working class people. You don't want new housing to be built, or you hate green space. You want to live in a car centric, you know, heat dome, you know, like, and it's like, no, like you can be critical and just ask, like, let's do those things.
Let's make sure that working class people aren't like displaced by these kinds of beautification methods.
Yeah, it's just a question of power.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah.
politics. They try to they're trying to depoliticize those issues, so don't let them. Is what I'm saying.
That's great.
right.
That's great. No, thank
Yeah.
you for that reminder. Well, I mean, these plans, back to me, these plans are sort of ongoing. As you're saying, there is a lot of community engagement left for Montreal 2050.
Yeah.
There's also just like 25 years left. So it's going to be up to you, listener, to raise some hell with the administration.
You guys only got one listener.
No, I like to talk to the
Okay.
listener like one on one.
Yeah. I was worried. I was freaking me out.
Yeah, it's my mom.
Yeah.
I think that concludes today's episode. Thank you for coming to the show and speaking on these housing issues. It's always interesting picking your brain on these things. I always come out of it learning a little more about how housing works in the city, how people are approaching it, and some alternatives to how it could be approached.
Yeah.
So thank you for coming, guys.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Super. I mean, I just love to yap about urban planning. Just
I
spent
know,
2 years
right.
doing it, so
Yeah, you got a lot to say.
I guess I do. Yeah.
All right.
Well, yeah. Thanks for having me. It was really fun, and
course.
maybe I'll be back on someday.
Count your lucky stars.
Yeah,
We'll think about it. After you drop that line about loving parks, I don't know if we can have you on.
Oh God.
It pushes the envelope. Anyways, folks, back to me. We'll be right back with Savannah and Hello Goodbye Lines. Stay tuned.